In this video I'll be showing you step by step how to disassemble, repair and then reassemble the Sony 16-50mm kit lens. A very common problem with the Sony 16-50mm is an error message from the camera saying that the lens can't be recognized and asking you to connect it properly. In probably 90% of cases, this is due to the failure of one specific part, which you can buy for just a couple of dollars or euros. But replacing it's quite a complicated process if you've never taken a lens apart before, so hopefully you'll find this video useful if it's a repair you need to do yourself. First, on the bottom of the lens you'll find 4 screws, which can be removed with a Phillips size 0 or 00 screwdriver. After removing the screws, don't try to lift off the lens mount just yet, since the contacts are still connected to the PCB underneath by a flex cable. Slide the lens mount very slightly to the left and you'll see a connector underneath the contacts. Use the flat end of a spudger to flip up the black retaining flap on the connector to release the flex cable, and then you can use your finger to slide it back out of its socket. Now you should see 3 small rubber standoffs, indicated here by the red circles. You might notice that I've only got 2, and that's because the third one was stuck to the lens mount and came off with it when I lifted it out. Use some tweezers or your fingers to lift out these small rubber pieces and put them somewhere safe. Now we've got 3 more flex cables to disconnect before we can remove the main board. Using your fingernail or a spudger, flip up the retaining flap and then slide the connector backwards out of its socket. Once all 3 flex cables have been disconnected, you can lift up the main board and remove it from the lens. Next, we're going to remove the motor assembly. To do this, we first need to remove these 2 screws. After removing those screws, if you look underneath the flex cable, you'll find another screw holding a metal bracket. This needs to be removed too. Under the metal bracket, you'll find another flex cable. This connector can be pried straight up using the pointed end of a spudger or some tweezers, and then you can lift out the motor assembly. Next, we've got 4 more screws to remove, which are securing the outer lens barrel and focus ring. After removing those screws, you'll find that the outer barrel is now free to move. But you still can't take it off completely yet because it's stopped by these 3 metal pins that catch on the lip at the end of the barrel. To free it, you can insert the flat end of a spudger into the gap between the inner barrel and the outer barrel, right at the point where the metal pin is, and apply slight pressure to the outer barrel, just enough for the pin to clear the edge. After releasing one pin, the other 2 should be freed very easily, and then the focus ring can be lifted off. Now it's time to remove the front element housing. You don't actually need to do this for this repair, but I'll show you how it's done anyway, in case you have some dust or moisture behind the front element that you want to clean. The front housing has pins on the inside that slide along these grooves on the side of the inner barrel. To remove it completely, slide it along the groove right up to the top, and then at this point keep rotating it anti-clockwise, moving it back down along this groove to the right, and when it gets to the end the pins will be freed and it can be lifted off. Now we need to detach the flex cable from the plastic ring at the bottom of the inner barrel. It's only held on by a mild adhesive, so you can just carefully peel it up. With the flex cable detached, the ring can be lifted off by rotating it until it frees from the inner barrel. Now, being careful not to trap the flex cable, this inner barrel with the grooves can just be lifted off. It's a good idea to use a marker pen here to mark where the 2 parts separate, since it makes reassembly a lot easier. This plastic ring is the reason why my lens wasn't working. There should be 3 plastic tabs like this one that keep it attached to the inner barrel. But on my lens, I've only got one tab left. The other two had broken off and were loose inside the lens. This is where they should sit. I've heard of people using super glue to reattach them, but a repair like that isn't likely to last very long, so I'd really recommend just buying a new part. You can find this ring on AliExpress for a very low price. There are several different sellers with prices ranging from under $1 to over $6 with free shipping. I ended up buying 3 of them from different sellers. One for €1.88, one for about €3 and the other one for €6, assuming that the more expensive ones would be better quality. But when they arrived, they were all identical, so just save your money and get the cheapest one you can find. I'll link to this part down in the video description. Now it's time to start putting everything back together. Hold the inner and outer parts of this assembly together so that these 2 plastic pins are lined up parallel to each other like this. If you look at the inner barrel, you'll see these indentations around the edge, which is where these 2 pins fit. Line up the 2 pins with the 2 indentations and slide the parts together. If you've done it right, they should be perfectly flush like this, with the edge of the inner part lining up perfectly with the edge of the outer barrel. If you find that the inner part doesn't go all the way in and stands proud of the outer ring like this, then you'll know that you've done it wrong. There are 3 possible orientations that you can put the parts back together, so just rotate the outer ring by 120 degrees and try again. Now we can install our new replacement ring. Push the inner barrel outwards by about 1 centimeter like this. Now take the replacement ring, rotate it clockwise until it drops into place, and then rotate it back until the flex cable lines up with the mounting point. You'll see these 2 plastic pins, which fit inside 2 indentations on the flex cable. Put the cable into position and then press down with your finger. There should still be enough adhesive left on the back to hold it in place. Now, before replacing the front element, I'm just going to give the glass a quick clean with a lens cloth and then a few blows with a rocket blower to make sure that it's free of dust. On the inside of the front lens assembly, you can see 3 grooves, and these tabs on the outside of the inner barrel slide into these grooves. Line up the 2 parts, turn the inner barrel counterclockwise until you hear a click as the pins drop into the groove, and then rotate it clockwise, guiding the pins along the grooves on the barrel. When you get to this point, push the 2 parts together, the pin will slide down into this groove and the lens will collapse together so that everything is completely flush. And that's the difficult part out of the way. Now we're going to replace the outer barrel and focus ring. On the outside of the front lens assembly, you'll see these plastic tabs. These slide into these grooves on the inside of the outer barrel. Line up the tabs on the front assembly with the grooves on the outer barrel, then use your thumb to exert some pressure on the inner barrel, just enough to allow the tab to pass under the lip on the edge, and the 2 parts should slide together. Now it's time to replace the motor. You'll see 2 plastic pins indicated here by the red circles. These pins sit inside these 2 inner holes on the motor assembly. Drop the motor into place and then use your finger to push the smaller of the 2 flex cables back onto its connector. Now take the metal bracket, put it back into position over the flex cable with the plastic pin through the smaller of the 2 holes on the bracket as shown here. And finally replace the screw. Now you can replace the 4 screws securing the outer barrel and focus ring. Now it's time to replace the PCB. It's easiest to reattach the 2 flex cables on the left before putting the PCB back into the lens, since it gives you more room. Make sure that the retention flap is in the raised position, slide the connector into the socket and then close the flap. Now you can drop the PCB back into place and reattach the larger flex cable on the other side. Lift up the retaining flap, slide in the connector and then close the flap. Before replacing the lens mount, I'm just giving the rear element a clean with a lens cloth and then using a rocket blower to make sure that there's no loose dust on the glass or floating around inside the lens. Now you can replace the 3 small rubber standoffs onto their posts around the edge of the PCB. And then you can reattach the last ribbon cable between the PCB and the lens contacts. You may find that tweezers are helpful here to push it into the connector. Then you can close the retention flap and lower the lens mount back into place. All that's left to do now is to replace the 4 screws on the lens mount. With that done, it's time to put the lens onto a camera and test it. Before, this lens wasn't working at all. I got the lens not recognized message after a couple of seconds. And now it extends when I turn the camera on and everything works perfectly. This is a fairly time-consuming repair. It probably took me the best part of an hour and a half, but the part needed for the repair is very cheap, and it's definitely worth the time investment to avoid having to buy a new lens. I hope this video helped. If you have any questions, put them down in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. That's it for now, thanks for watching.